Well, welcome everyone. We're so excited today to have former Ambassador to Mexico, Christopher Landau here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, so Mr. Landau, Ambassador, we know him, of course, from his role as serving our country as Ambassador to Mexico. But Mr. Landau has had quite a storied career and a distinguished career. He's practiced law before his appointment to ambassador. He practiced law in Washington, D.C. for 30 years. And most of that time, he was a partner at the prestigious law firm Kirkland and Ellis and head of the firm's appellate litigation practice. And he's briefed and argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and the Federal Court of Appeals. And at the beginning of his legal career, he served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justices Scalia and Thomas. And interestingly, I thought this was fascinating. Mr. Landau was born into a career of foreign service, or a foreign service family, I should say. His father, George Landau, served as the ambassador to Paraguay, Chile, and Venezuela in the 70s and 80s. So Mr. Landau is a Harvard College graduate and law school graduate, and he's a trustee of the U.S. Supreme Court Historical Society and a director of the Diplomacy Center Foundation. Goodness. Well, we are honored to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. And please don't hold it against me that I went to Harvard. Nowadays, that's hardly a mark of distinction.
Well, we'll get past it because I know we're going to have a fantastic conversation. And it's so timely that you're with us today. We're going to talk a little bit about Mexico's election. They just elected a new president, but we'll get to that topic in a little bit. But first, what I was really hoping to do is kind of talk to you big picture a little bit in terms of how migration from Mexico and through Mexico has changed over the last 20 to 30 years. You know, back in the 80s, most of our migrants, or the illegal migrants at least, were coming from Mexico. And now everything has changed. You know, the cartels control most of the border. We see so many migrants coming up from South America and Central America. And Mexico, in many ways, has become a transit country. And it's a new role, I guess, if you want to use that word, a new role for Mexico. For those who are seeking asylum, they do have an asylum system. And some argue it's not really strong, but they do have an asylum system, and they have certainly laws regarding illegal entry. But let me ask you this. Do you think that Mexicans, or at least the Mexican government maybe, do they look at illegal immigration as a problem? Do they see it as illegal immigration, or they just see it as people moving towards the United States?
Well, Julie, I think you put your finger on a very important point to frame this whole conversation, which is the phenomenon of migration has changed massively in a relatively short period of time. We're really talking the past 10 years or so, starting during the last few years of the Obama administration in particular, when we started to see a lot of non-Mexicans for the first time crossing the U.S. Mexico border illegally. As you noted, historically in the 80s, 90s, up until the 2000s, the vast majority of people crossing our border, our southern border with Mexico, were Mexicans. It's a kind of a unique border. It's, I think, the only border in the world, direct land border where a first world country, is directly adjacent to a third world country. And, that has implications. It's a 2,000-mile border. A lot of that is pretty inhospitable terrain. And so, we've certainly faced, some serious migratory surges from Mexico before. For that reason, our immigration system was kind of set up to deal with single adult male Mexican men. The system kind of figured out how to swiftly remove those people and repatriate them back to Mexico. Things started changing, as I mentioned, about 10 years ago. I think 2013, 2014 were some of the first surges from Central America. There was a lot of unaccompanied minors that were sent up from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And starting again about 10 years ago, we started to see large numbers of non-Mexicans. For the first time, really, in the past 5 years or so, pretty steadily, non-Mexicans have outnumbered Mexicans at the border. And again, for a while, we saw lots from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, as I mentioned. But actually, now, I was just talking to somebody from the CBP the other day, and they said even those numbers are down and have been displaced by people from much further afield. Both within the Western Hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, Haiti, also Ecuador, Brazil. Within the hemisphere, but then also from the whole world. I mean, it really is kind of the United Nations now. I mean, we see Vietnamese, Bangladeshis, Chinese, Ukrainians, Yemenis, Jordanians, Turks, uh, Congo, you name it, they are there. And so the whole phenomenon of migration is very different, and our system is not set up to kind of uh, deal with people, either family units or people who come from these countries far afield, some of which are not particularly receptive to taking back their people. So it is a very different phenomenon now, which is a challenge for the United States, but it creates an incredible opportunity for our relationship with Mexico, because for the first time, really, Mexico and the United States share an interest in controlling these flows of migrants from all over the world who are basically now using Mexico as a doormat to try to enter the United States illegally. Traditionally, as you might expect, Mexicans have a pretty soft spot for migrants. A lot of them have family members who are migrants. And listen, a lot of these migrants actually come here to work, and so they're not necessarily bad people. A lot of them want to come here for the same reasons that a lot of our ancestors wanted to come here. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have to follow the rules. I mean, the United States, our laws have certain rules. People have to wait in line. People seeking to come here legally have to wait many, many years and jump through many hoops. And I think nobody is kind of more aggrieved than they in terms of having other people walk to the front of the line. So, I think the essence of our sovereignty is our ability as Americans through our political process to decide who comes into our country and under what circumstances. And we can have debates about what the appropriate levels of legal migration should be, but you would think we could all agree as Americans that as between legal migration and illegal migration, we should do everything we can to combat illegal migration, which is also not fair to the people who come illegally, or it's very destructive for them because they have to live in the shadows, right? We have all these gold-plated laws, workplace protection, discrimination, all these things, and a lot of these people can't take advantage of that because they're afraid of being deported. So we're creating an underclass in our own country, which I think is very dangerous. Anyway, that was a long answer to your question, but I guess the point I really want to make is that the demographic change of these migrant flows creates challenges for the United States in terms of mechanisms for dealing with this are different than the mechanisms we had developed previously for single adult male Mexicans, and opens opportunities for us to cooperate with Mexico so that Mexico will enforce its own migration laws. The one final point I'll make in this is that I think it underscores that migration is now a central issue for American foreign policy generally and at the global level. It is no longer something that just belongs on the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship. If somebody comes from Bangladesh, takes a flight to Turkey, has a visa to Brazil, then crosses Brazil, crosses Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and then enters Mexico, why is the United States only dealing with this as if it's a problem with Mexico? I mean, this should be a problem so the United States should be bringing up in its diplomatic efforts with every one of those countries along the way, going all the way back to Bangladesh where it started. And I don't think our foreign policy establishment yet has come to grips with the fact that migration is just going to have to be a major topic for U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. To that point, You were talking about just a minute ago, you were talking about how we work with Mexico to ensure that they enforce their laws. And I had a smart professor in law school tell me, one time when you're negotiating a deal, you need to understand how um, your adversary or whoever it is, opposing counsel,
Counterparty, yeah.
you need to understand how they think. Do
Right.
you, what do you, how do you think Mexico perceives this new phenomenon of being, or this new role it's playing as sort of a transit country? Does the government view illegal immigration from the South as a problem? Do you think Mexicans view all these migrants as a problem? Are we there yet where they have the will to enforce their own laws?
I think this is in flux, and I thought as ambassador that was one of my primary challenges was to be discussing these kind of issues frankly with the Mexican people. As I mentioned, I think historically Mexican sentiments were on the side of the migrants because so many of the migrants were their own friends and relatives and family there's probably few households in Mexico that don't have somebody who has migrated to the U.S. in the last generation. It's just been a massive surge. So, there is a kind of deep harbor of sympathy to the migrants and kind of respect for the hard work that they do in the United States, the money they send back to Mexico. The remittances are a major part of the Mexican economy. But I think when the Mexicans look around on the streets of Mexico City, again, it's like looking at the United Nations. I mean, you see, Africans there, people from other Latin American countries who speak very different Spanish, again, people from China, Vietnam. I think Mexico has a lot of problems of its own, and I don't think the Mexican people appreciate or see what's in it for Mexico to be, again, a doormat for the whole world trying to enter the United States illegally. So I think this, opens the door for us to work closely with Mexico, and that's actually it started under President Trump. When President Lopez Obrador came into office, AMLO, he's commonly known, in December of 2018, some of his advisors were quick to say, Central American brothers and sisters, you are welcome in Mexico. And what that led to almost immediately was a surge of caravans. And Mexico is a sovereign country. It's free to have its own migration system. But if 99.9% of the people that Mexico welcomes into its country as under its immigration laws immediately proceed to the US border to enter our country, then it's no longer a Mexican domestic issue, then that's a direct assault on our sovereignty. And so, we have a very, very legitimate interest in telling Mexico, what the heck are you doing? That is a very unneighborly thing to do to, welcome people into your house only so they can try to come into my house.
Yeah.
And I think the Lopez Obrador government recognized that quickly, and President Trump threatened tariffs in the spring of 2019, and the Mexicans reversed course almost immediately. And that was really the first time in history that they worked closely with the United States government. They were enforcing their own immigration laws, which of course they have, and again, that was not a particularly politically controversial issue in Mexico when I was there. I mean, there's a few kind of, hardliners, more old timers, but I don't think among the people in the street they had any problem with Mexico preventing these, massive uncontrolled migratory flows, these caravans marching through Mexican territory.
Well, so to that point on some of the Trump policies, you were serving as ambassador during a really interesting time, and you mentioned the President Trump threatening tariffs. You were also there, I believe, for when Remain in Mexico was rolled out. You were also there when COVID happened. I mean, that has to be challenging. But tell us, a little bit more about some of your experiences with these policies. So, for example, Remain in Mexico, it only works. I mean, personally, I think the better solution would be, well, I think Remain in Mexico is a great program, but it would be great if we could have safe third countries, in throughout Central America. So we had fewer people, crushing themselves up against our border. I think it would be better for everyone if we did that. But that said, Remain in Mexico was a fabulous deterrent, and it worked almost instantaneously. Can you tell us maybe just a little bit more about your experience with that program?
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, to me, Remain in Mexico, which was a very successful program, but it always seemed a little bit to miss the point because Remain in Mexico means somebody can already make an asylum request in the United States, and it was avoiding the problem that had basically plagued the system, that when you have hundreds of thousands of people coming in and making asylum requests at the same time, the system can't process that at once. So this was kind of the loophole in our asylum system where we were unable to adjudicate these requests in a timely manner. And so asylum seekers, we just kind of sign up for our asylum programs and then be released into the United States, say, well, okay, see you in your interview in like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And a lot of times those people didn't show up for the interviews. I mean, in a sense, it was kind of a free ticket to come into the United States. So as soon as you say, okay, you can sign up for our asylum program, but guess what? You're not going to get to wait in the United States in the meantime. You have to remain in Mexico. That almost immediately dried up the flow of asylum seekers because let's face it, everybody knows this, that the vast, vast majority of these people are not asylum seekers. I mean, people should understand we have a very comprehensive immigration regime, right? Then we have this asylum exception, I'd say. It's almost an asterisk to say if there's certain people who are in imminent danger of death based on, certain prescribed characteristics, their politics, their religion, their race. I mean, this all came out of World War II and the terrible plight of the Jews who found themselves, basically stuck. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with the story of the ship St. Louis that sailed out of Europe, was looking for a harbor, went to Cuba. Nobody would let these people off. The United States refused entry. Eventually, the ship had to turn around and go back to Europe, and I think a lot of the passengers perished. So, the asylum system was a response to a particular need that people needed to flee their country in a hurry, and the normal immigration system was not equipped to deal with that. We have a very different situation now where people from around the world are are fleeing their country, but then they're crossing a whole bunch of countries that are perfectly, acceptable safe havens for them to escape the immediate peril that they were allegedly fleeing from in their homeland. And they're just, claiming asylum, 5 or 10 countries down the road. Asylum is not it's supposed to be a safe haven in a storm, right? It's not supposed to completely swallow up all of our immigration laws, which is what it's done.
Yeah.
And so basically, the Remain in Mexico policy was actually unrolled before I arrived. For some reason that I don't understand, it became political, the safe third country concept, under which basically if somebody had passed through a country like Mexico, if somebody said, I'm a refugee, I'm an asylum seeker from Guatemala because the government is out to kill me for my political views, right? And then they cross Mexico to come to the United States. Well, if they could have sought asylum in Mexico, why are they then waiting to reach the United States to seek asylum? I mean, it kind of doesn't make sense when you think about the whole purpose of asylum, right? And the real sad thing, Julie, is when you wind up overloading the asylum system with hundreds of thousands of mostly frivolous complaints, what happens then is the people who actually might need asylum get lost like a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
And so, for some reason, the Mexicans did not like the idea that their country would be considered a safe third country, and that basically anybody from another country passing through Mexico would be disentitled from seeking asylum in the United States. In a sense, I think that policy is a tribute to Mexico. It's saying we actually respect your institutions, Mexico, and precisely because you can give refuge to people, like, there's no need for them to seek asylum in our country. For whatever reason, that became politically toxic in Mexico. And so the Mexicans agreed to the Remain in Mexico policy, which in a lot of ways is more intrusive to Mexico, because under that policy, people would go to the United States, they would enroll in the U.S. asylum system, but then they'd wait in Mexico. But then that gets the U.S. courts involved in deciding whether their conditions in Mexico were really safe enough. And there were, the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit said that they weren't. And, it kind of gets U.S. courts in the business of determining, the adequacy of Mexico as a waiting station. So I think your point is right, but the bottom line is that it is interesting that almost overnight, the flow of asylum seekers ground to a halt. Because I think, again, it was not real asylum claims. These were basically just attempts to game the system to get into the United States. Once people realized that the gig was up, they stopped trying. So, unlike some of the fears in Mexico with that policy, that Mexico would then become, have this huge backlog of people waiting, as soon as people realized that this asylum gambit was no longer going to pay off, they just didn't they didn't leave their countries. I mean,
Yeah.
people are not they're economically rational, right? Nobody undertakes this very perilous journey, whether their home is in Bangladesh or in Guatemala or in Mexico itself. Nobody crosses into the United States without crossing through cartel-controlled territory in northern Mexico, right? And paying huge amounts of money to the cartels. This is, I've heard some estimates that this could be bigger business for these criminal groups in Mexico than drugs.
Wow.
Okay. And people are not foolish. They don't undertake that unless they think that they have a good chance of success in, getting across Mexico, getting into the United States, and then remaining in the United States. So once you kind of move the dial a little bit by policy choices on the likelihood of these things happening, that has massive downstream implications for people's conduct. The other point I just wanted to mention in response to your question, you also asked me about the pandemic. And in the early days of the pandemic, as some of your listeners may recall, the United States invoked a law called Title 42, which is basically a quarantine law that says, in times of a health emergency, basically the United States immigration system, is kind of preempted, let's say, by this public health provision that allows the U.S. basically to quarantine itself, so that if anybody is kind of found, attempting to enter the United States, they can be summarily returned, to their home country, or kind of pushed back across the border. I mean, you kind of imagine, like, if a ship pulls into the harbor and there's some kind of outbreak on board, you can prevent the passenger of the ship from disembarking in the city. It was kind of the same thing on a national level during COVID. And, that was a very effective tool for basically very expeditiously allowing the border patrol essentially to eject people immediately without kind of getting them into the whole U.S. immigration system and all the bells and whistles that entails. And Mexico agreed, as it has historically, that they would take back their own nationals. That is the responsibility of any country under international law. If their nationals are found attempting to enter another country illegally, they have a responsibility to take them back. Um, but Mexico, not surprisingly, balked at taking back everybody trying to cross Mexico, because there was a lot, again, the majority probably, who were not Mexicans. So we wound up negotiating with the Mexicans, and they eventually agreed that they would take back not only their own people, but also the people crossing the U.S. Mexico border from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which were the majority at that point of the non-Mexicans, because Mexico had its own agreements with those countries to repatriate people. And that was, by far the largest share of people. And then the U.S., if we would catch, let's say, people from India or China, we would be responsible for putting them on planes and sending them home. But, again, Title 42 worked very well as another deterrent for people to try to enter the U.S. illegally, and we made it work with the Mexican government. They understood that this was a huge priority for the Trump administration, and they respected that. And they were willing to work cooperatively with us.
So, um, taking that point and running with it here, do you think that something has changed? Maybe it's the Biden administration. Was AMLO's view of cooperation, did it change? Did it evolve? Because recently, and I know it raised a lot of eyebrows in immigration circles, AMLO, well, I think it was about late last year, the Mexican government said, well, we're not sure we can enforce the laws on our border anymore. According to the news reports I read, apparently they just said they were out of money. And AMLO then went on, apparently privately and publicly went on 60 Minutes and said, well, we think the United States has to give $20 billion in foreign aid to, Central American countries, and he has to adopt policy changes, give work authorization to millions of Mexicans living in the United States and things of that sort. And to a lot of people, it sounded like extortion. And then, wouldn't you know, all of these diplomats go down, I believe, Secretary of State Blinken went down there, all suddenly talking at the highest levels of government to see what they could do. And suddenly at the beginning of this year, oh, we see a little more cooperation from Mexico. And the administration seems to be strong arming, some of these Central American governments to do what the Biden administration won't do themselves, which is secure their own southern border. So do you think that, there's been a shift in terms of cooperation since President Biden became president? Or how do you see AMLO's tenure sort of evolving?
Well, let me just take that chronologically, because I think what you said is correct in the sense that, January 20th, 2021 rolls along. President Biden comes into office. The first thing he does on day one is immediately revoke a lot of the Trump administration policies, which had basically sent a clear message to discourage illegal immigration, and actually sends exactly the opposite message. Says basically, we're not going to be deporting people. These Trump policies were mean, and we are going to, really, totally change our enforcement priorities at the border, which was kind of understood throughout the world as open borders. And actually, that's exactly what it was. So all of a sudden, even starting before Inauguration Day, I mean, I was ambassador until January 20th. The last few days I was in Mexico City, my wife and I were driving around, and we would see all these foreigners, obviously non-Mexicans, walking the streets, and we'd be like, what are you doing? And they're like, we love Biden, we love Biden. They were already coming. And it wasn't that there was, an earthquake in their country or a coup had put in some, government that was persecuting them. These are just, there's a lot of poor people in the world. I mean, the world has what, 8 billion people? Like, a lot of people would rather be in the United States, if all things being equal. I can't blame them for that, right? But, historically, under our Constitution, Congress has enacted certain laws governing migration, and the constitutional responsibility of the executive, the president, is to enforce those laws. But President Biden made it very clear he had no intention of enforcing those laws from day one of his administration. So at that point, basically, the whole system that we had crafted with the Mexicans, which the Mexicans were actually very comfortable, because again, it is not in their interest to see their country overrun with caravans, particularly at this time period. This was still during the pandemic, so we were talking about people, wearing masks or not wearing masks when they should have been wearing masks. I mean, this was like, kind of a period when, if anybody should have ever recognized the need for sovereign nations to control their borders, you would think the pandemic would have kind of underscored that. But anyway, and the Biden administration was making everybody else mask up and, like, putting sand in the playground so children couldn't go outside, but they were at the same time welcoming in all these, hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people, none of whom had been necessarily vaccinated or had any background on their health, just coming up in huge, caravans and groups into our country. Anyway, so I think the Mexicans look around and say, look, the United States is basically rolling out the red carpet for these people, right? Like, what is our role now? Like, we can't want it more than they do. I think the Mexicans basically threw up their hands and says, okay, look, if the gringos don't care, like, about these flows, well, why should we care? And so, Mexico basically, resorted to a more passive role, and let a lot of these caravans go through. Now, when this became, almost immediately a huge problem for the Biden administration, the Biden administration could never admit that this surge of illegal migration was caused by its policies, right? So instead, their watchword was, it's all about root causes. And the answer to this is to solve the root causes of migration, which means let's spend more money in Central America. Let's turn Honduras into Switzerland, and that will, reduce illegal immigrant flows. Okay, I mean, these are like fantasy land scenarios, and again, everything was caused by their own policies, right? It was not, again, there was not an economic meltdown in Honduras that led to this. It was basically, you know, no matter how much money we pour into some of these countries, much of which is stolen or goes to the elites, like, we're not going to raise the standard of living around the world to the standard of living in the United States. Or else, if we do, we're going to send so much money abroad that the standard of living in the United States will very quickly resemble the standard of living in Honduras, right? So, but the Biden administration, it's very important for them to kind of maintain the fiction that this is all about the root causes, right? So that they basically open themselves up to blackmail from all these countries that say, okay, it's about root causes, give me money, right? And so the Mexicans aren't dumb, right? If the Biden administration needs them to basically incant its mantra of root causes, they're delighted to do that. They said, like, yes, please give us $20 billion for development in ourselves. Like, they'd be foolish not to, right? I mean, it's clear the Biden administration has no problem printing more money and sending it abroad. My understanding, frankly, and I've heard this from sources I have in Mexico, is that some of these high-level visits recently struck a deal between the Biden administration and the Mexican government to pay the Mexican government something along the lines of $1 billion a month between now and November, conveniently our elections,
Yeah, right.
to basically, staunch the flow of migrants from third countries across Mexico. And so, when Mexico wants to do it, it actually has the ability to make a pretty serious dent. I think those numbers are down substantially. I have to say, I find it very hard to understand how the Biden administration could even find that kind of money, like sloshing around our government to pay Mexico $1 billion a month. I mean, if I needed a couple of extra $1,000 in the embassy, it was like, trying to get blood out of a stone to get more money from Washington. But apparently for this, that, Congress certainly has not allocated money to this
Yeah,
end. So I don't know where they're
that's
finding
an
it.
excellent
And
point.
again, I'm only hearing this secondhand by hearsay, but it certainly comports with the facts that all of a sudden the Mexicans are I think doing a lot more to stop all these, stop the border, stop these surges at the border that were so politically damaging to the president.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, I can't necessarily say I blame the Mexicans if the Americans have basically put themselves in a situation that gave the Mexicans all the leverage. Why not try to get some money out of it?
Yeah, well, and I completely agree. But the point I do want to make to our viewers, our members here, of course, is that, whatever's at least is, I mean, I've been working in immigration for about 20 years now, and any cooperation I've seen has been fleeting. They go through these
Yep.
phases where they want to do it and they do some steps, and then they decide it's not in their interest, or they don't, have the political willpower to keep doing it. So as you said, if money, if it turns out that money was paid or has been paid, it'll probably end as soon as the election starts. I mean, as the election is over. I mean,
Yeah,
why
I
would
agree
they
with you.
keep that up? Why would they keep that up? So, I
No,
mean, I
I,
guess I
that,
want
that
our
was
viewers to understand that the numbers might be down somewhat, but this is temporary.
100%. I mean, again, that was what I was told, at least, that basically this was all a deal just until November, right?
Yeah.
And that, once the election's over, Biden is reelected, again, I think we can expect to see another massive wave
Yeah,
of illegal migration. And frankly, at that point, he doesn't really care because he will have been he can't serve another term,
exactly.
uh, and he would have been reelected, notwithstanding the greatest abdication, I think, of presidential responsibility that I've seen in my lifetime, where a
Yeah,
president has just kind of flatly refused to enforce federal law.
yeah,
And has come up with all these loopholes and excuses. I mean, I think anybody who's focused on this border situation, if they don't have their blood boiling, then there's something wrong with their internal circulation system. Because it's about as bad as it can get. But again, I do want to underscore, Julie, that I do think there's a note of optimism here in the sense that the Mexicans have shown that they are capable of doing this when they want to, of being very helpful. I do think it is a mistake, though, for us as Americans to think that we can outsource our migration, the solution to our
absolutely.
migration woes to Mexico or to any other country.
I 1,000%
Mexico,
agree. Yeah,
again, Mexico can be very helpful, but I think we make a grave mistake if we are doomed to failure if we put our destiny in the hands of the Mexicans on this, right? And I think we have to be, as Americans, looking a lot more closely at what we can do in our own
yeah,
country to reduce the incentives for these for such vast illegal migration, including in particular, um, frankly, businesses that hire not we're not talking about hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. We're talking about millions of people are being employed illegally. And so there's entire industries in our country that are built on the backs of illegal aliens and their labor, which is exploitative towards the illegal aliens. And those businesses, it's not that hard to identify them, right? And I think, how can we be getting mad at Mexico and saying you're not doing enough if we're not lifting a finger to go after, in a sense, what is the engine of the illegal migration, which is the demand here? It's like we can't ask Mexico to run around and try to catch, people like rabbits if we have a huge box of carrots on our side of the border and nobody's doing anything about it. So again, my job as ambassador to Mexico was to focus on, getting Mexican cooperation. But I have to say, it became very clear to me that we were missing the bigger picture of what we have to do on our side of the border as well.
yeah. That's really interesting and well put. Let's shift just a little bit. I want to talk about, you were just saying how the government, the Biden administration hasn't lifted a finger. And actually, some other previous presidents probably deserve some blame too, but the Biden administration certainly hasn't done anything. And in fact, has made it easier for migrants to come. Um, but, let's take a look at some of the impacts of these open border policies. And I want to raise the issue of China and its sort of what should we say? It's interesting relationship it's developing with Mexico. And we all know, for those of us who are in immigration circles, and certainly those of us who care about public safety, we all know that China produces a lot of the chemicals and precursors for meth and fentanyl and all that sort of stuff. And it gets shipped, imported to Mexico, and they cook it all up. They make pills and they bring it into the United States. But this is, a very scary relationship that's developing between the Chinese and the Mexican drug cartels. And how do you see that? How do you see that playing out? I mean, why are we doing enough to stop this partnership, which has huge implications for our sovereignty, for our public safety? I mean, it's a really scary thought.
Absolutely not. We're not doing enough. And you are right. So far, we've been talking about the border primarily through the lens of the illegal crossing of people. But another whole dimension to the border problem is the illegal crossing of narcotics, which are killing record numbers of Americans every year. I think it's been a record number every single year. We've broken the previous record going back at least 10 years. And again, I think the drug problem now is very different even than it was, 10 years or so ago. The synthetic opioids, basically you can be manufactured in the laboratory to be as strong as somebody wants. I mean, they're just literally dealing with the chemicals, right? So in the past, when people were talking about drugs, they're talking about heroin or cocaine, which are, they come from organic substances. They come from flowers or from other plants, right? And so there were plantations. We were not particularly successful in combating drug flows when they were like in plain sight on farms in Colombia and Peru and Mexico. This is a whole different world now where you can get much, much stronger drugs that are basically just manufactured in somebody's basement, and they can be, they can be done in such tiny amounts that basically the amount of fentanyl that's about the size of a grain of salt or a grain of sand is enough to kill an average sized human being, pure fentanyl. And not only is it just fentanyl, but then this stuff is being cut into all kinds of other drugs. I remember when I got to Mexico as ambassador, I had my drug enforcement team over to brief me on this. And I said, like, well, I'd like a list of, what overdoses in the United States are from, cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, meth, whatever other things. And, I kind of saw, okay, like, 20, I'm making up these numbers now, but like 20% cocaine, like, 30% heroin, 40% fentanyl, 20% meth. I mean, it added up to much more than 100%. And I said, well, I don't get this. And they said, well, that's because a lot of times these drugs are combined, right? So that you'll have fentanyl cut in with the cocaine, and that is listed both as a cocaine death and a fentanyl death. But it's really, I think, the fentanyl that allows you to take any other drug and immediately make it so much more potent and deadly. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of, particularly our young people, and this cuts across social class, demographics, geographic region, across our entire country. You have people dropping dead when they try a single pill because they don't know it. A lot of these pills could be produced in the, they look fine. You can't tell a fake pill doesn't have a big like F on the front, right? I mean, it actually looks exactly like another pill. And, some kid will say like, oh yeah, that, try it, it's fun. And, they can die. I mean, one of the most, heart-rending experiences as ambassador is to talk to the families of, people who have died, particularly young people, maybe the first time they ever tried a single pill. So there is no question that fentanyl is, I think, a game changer when it comes to drugs. And when I arrived in Mexico as ambassador about 5 years ago, it was still the case that most of the fentanyl was being actually produced in China and then sometimes shipped directly to the U.S. through the mails or transshipped through Mexico. But we were very concerned that basically Mexico would start to be a source of production of fentanyl. And sure enough, that happened. As China started to crack down on some of this stuff under pressure, they started just shipping a lot of the precursor chemicals to Mexico, where they're then pressed into pills in labs in basements in Mexico. Again, you don't need a huge industrial facility. A lot of times these are mobile labs, and the fact that we've lost control of the border and that our border agents have to be focusing on migrants and basically becoming social workers has made it much, much easier for these drugs to cross our border. It's challenging under the best of circumstances because, again, you could have a brick the size of an ordinary brick you might see in a house made up of fentanyl. That probably could have enough doses to kill like 100,000 people in just that brick. So in a 2,000-mile border, it's not so easy to catch all of those things. That's why, frankly, my view is that we in Mexico have to do a lot more to cooperate on the shipments coming in from China, whether it be fentanyl directly or the precursor chemicals. We have a joint interest in stopping those shipments. And one thing that's been very, very frustrating to me is that our law enforcement people are almost 100% focused on asking Mexico to catch the bad guys in Mexico and extradite them to the United States, which I don't have a problem with, trying to catch the bad guys like the El Chapos of the world and send them to be tried in the United States. But that is about 95%, I would say, of U.S. Mexico drug cooperation focuses on please catch the bad guys because we can't do our own law enforcement in Mexico. It's their sovereign country. So we have to be begging Mexico to catch the bad guys and turn them over to us for trial. And I just have seen time and again that doesn't really move the needle in terms of the broader drug problem. We gotta really focus a lot more on the source. So frankly, I think there's a lot of blame to go around, but I think a lot of our own law enforcement agencies are so quick just to say like this is all the Mexicans' fault because again, just like we can't outsource our immigration the solution to our immigration problems to Mexico. We can't outsource the solution to our drug problems to Mexico. We have to. There certainly are important things that Mexico has to do, but that can't be an excuse for us not to do the things that we need to do in our own country as well, that are within our control. That we don't have to be begging somebody else to do something. Including cutting down on the guns and the money that flow from our country back into Mexico, and frankly, attacking the demand here in the United States for drugs.
I hope whoever is elected president in the fall really
Yeah,
steps in. And like you said, I mean, it's crazy to let others manage our destiny or to have control of our destiny, and whether it's drugs or migrants, whatever. And what's interesting, and that when I started in immigration, like I said, about 20 years ago, I had Border Patrol agents and ICE agents tell me, no, 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 the drug trafficking and the well, trafficking, smuggling, they're very separate. They're done by different people. And in 20 years, it all changed. And now you have, drug cartels who are putting babies on the border. So all the Border Patrol agents go over there to try and save the kids. And meanwhile, the cartels are bringing in bricks and truckloads and whatever of drugs while they've distracted everyone with a baby in diapers. And it's
well,
it's
yes.
absolutely heartbreaking, but we have to control our own destiny. And as you said, what frustrates me is that when you say something like, well, Mexico needs to do this or someone else needs to do it, if you ask me, it's a way of just shifting the blame. Like it's not my problem. It's because someone else didn't do something, not because
I
I
couldn't.
failed.
That you are preaching to the choir here because that was my mantra. Look, I mean, again, I was the ambassador to Mexico, right? So my job description was to try to get the Mexican cooperation, and that was what I
Yeah.
did. But I also realized that a lot of people in Washington, it's just so easy to say, well, the Mexicans have to take care of this,
Yeah.
and they come down to Mexico and they say, well, we demand that you do X, Y, and Z on migration or on drugs, right? Okay, and then the Mexicans would say back, I was in these meetings. Like, well, guess what? What are you doing? Right? Like, we have to be able to answer those questions satisfactorily if we want the Mexicans to actually to do something. Why? It's just like any personal relationship. If you come around and just demand, and you say that, like, well, it's all that guy's fault. I mean, he's letting in all this bad stuff. Like, well, he's not going to be particularly motivated to help you with your problem if he feels like you're not helping yourself,
Yeah.
right? And
Exactly.
again, I think we have elections in our country, but we have a permanent bureaucracy that I think is kind of stuck, in a kind of traditional model for dealing with a lot of these problems that really requires shaking up because we haven't had results for 50, 60 years, and the problems are getting worse. And just passing the blame again, there's plenty of blame to go around, right? But we're not going to solve the problem if basically people in Washington point the finger at Mexico City and says it's all their fault, and people in Mexico City point the finger at Washington and says it's all their fault, right? Like, it seems to me that's what the dynamic has been for the last 60 years. I tried to break that as ambassador and say, like, I understand there are, this is it's a serious problem for both of us, right? We both should have a common interest in stopping unregulated flows of people across Mexico and into the United States. That's not in either country's interest. We should also have an interest in breaking the power of these criminal organizations. That's a big threat to Mexican sovereignty as well as to
Yes.
our own national prosperity and security. And stopping these flows of narcotics. These should be areas where we have joint interests. And I think that's what diplomacy is all about. Like, recognizing what your interests are, what the other side's interests are, and trying to come up with win-win solutions. But if we come down to Mexico and just says, okay, Mexico, these are the things you got to do, bang, 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 and then we expect the Mexicans to just like, click their heels and salute, that's not going to happen. And it hasn't happened for 50 years. But that's what a lot of people in Washington still expect to happen. And, it's easy for a lot of people like the DEA to say like, oh, it's all the Mexicans' fault. Because nobody's sitting there saying, well, DEA, what the heck have you done? Like, and do you think that are you being smart if you're following the same strategy you have followed without success for 50 years? I'd like to hear an answer to
Questions?
that.
Yeah. Well, speaking of finding solutions, let's just turn, actually, just as the last topic I wanted to discuss today, and thank you for your time. This has been a great discussion. Is Mexico's elected a new president, and her name is Claudia Sheinbaum, and she's really interesting person. She was the former mayor of Mexico City, but she's also known, well, she's known as the first female president of Mexico and the first Jewish president, but also she's known as an academic. She has a doctorate in, I think it's energy engineering, I believe. And actually, she got her master's at UC Berkeley. Really interesting person. From the reports I've read, she was handpicked by AMLO to replace him. They're from the same party. He served as, I mean, he was her mentor, and she ran on a campaign of continuity. How do you see her presidency is taking shape? Is she gonna change course? Is she gonna do anything different, or can we expect more of the same?
I think by and large, she will follow AMLO's footsteps. I mean, I think this election that she won, in a three-way race with almost 60% of the vote is really can't be interpreted as anything other than a referendum on AMLO in Mexico. And, that was an overwhelming approval. AMLO is kind of an outsider. He's a little bit like Trump, except that Trump basically engineered a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, whereas AMLO basically founded his own party about 10 years ago. And the kind of two traditional parties in Mexico are so discredited by years of corruption and scandals that basically public support for them collapsed. And I think we're basically seeing in Mexico almost the absence of an opposition at this point, as these election results show. Scheinbaum is a protege of President Lopez Obrador. You never know. In Mexico certainly has a history where presidents have kind of indicated who they'd like their successors to be, and the successors don't always follow the path that a president might have expected. It's a little bit like U.S. presidents appointing Supreme Court justices. There can be surprises. But, I mean, I think she's a pretty firm believer I think she and AMLO definitely think alike. So I would expect there to be a lot of continuity. I think the big variable here is what will happen in the U.S. election. And certainly if President Trump comes in, I think relations with Mexico will shift radically. I don't think necessarily for the worse. I mean, again, I was ambassador under President Trump before President Lopez Obrador, and we managed to work together very well and very productively because President Trump was very clear on what he wanted. And he's a nationalist representing the interests of the United States and its people. And President Lopez Obrador is the same for Mexico. He's kind of a Mexico first kind of guy. I suspect that President Scheinbaum will be the same way. And, we were able to work, I think, very constructively with AMLO, even though, he's a man from the political left and President Trump was from the political right. We were able to find lots of common ground. So I have little doubt that given how interdependent the countries are on a whole variety of issues, Mexico and the United States are each other's largest trading partners, and our trade agreement is up for renewal in 2026, which provides a big incentive for both sides to work cooperatively on these other issues, because it's hard to imagine that we're going to renew that agreement if we're, caught in an acrimonious struggle on these other issues. So, just as people predicted that Lopez Obrador and Trump would have a terrible relationship, and they didn't. I think whoever's president in Mexico is basically going to be forced to work pretty closely with whoever's president in the United States. And, if it's President Trump, I think we'll probably go back to a lot of the patterns that were there during the years when he was in office before with President Lopez Obrador. I think even with President Sheinbaum in power.
Really interesting stuff. Well, Ambassador Landau, I can't tell you what an honor it's been to have you today. We're just thrilled to have you. I hope you'll come back again and talk to us as things develop. President-elect Sheinbaum, I guess, she will take office October 1st. So there's a lot of time between now and then to see.
There is. They actually reduced their transition time. It used to, remember, like the United States, it used to be March 4th was
I do
inauguration
remember,
day,
yeah.
and that was so long after November that I think during the FDR administration they shortened it. They just shortened it in Mexico. They have their elections in June, and the new president didn't used to take office until December 1st, so it's almost
Wow.
half a year. They just moved that up to October 1st. So there'll be a month basically where President Sheinbaum is in office before the presidential election in the U.S. I don't expect any major moves in that time while everybody waits to see what happens in the U.S. And then, it's all going to depend what happens November 5th here in our country.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you again so much for your time, and we hope you'll come back to talk to us and to our members.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yep.